The Ghent altarpiece, the Lam Gods, is certainly the best known of all early Netherlandish paintings. It is one of the largest, as you all know, and it has an extremely complicated history. And I think it is one of the works, or it's almost unique among the artworks of the world, in that it has been so often in and out of its original location. So in situ, ex situ, in situ, ex situ, in situ, ex situ. And so no, that was not even enough. It has been placed in the Fight Chapel in St. Bavo 6 times, and it had been taken out of the chapel 6 times in its history, which is really remarkable. And here, that's its original location in the Fight Chapel, where it was placed, I think, in 1432, and it soon became a most famous work, and we have evidence already from the 15th and then from the 16th century that it was shown, and there was a special account in St. Barth, or at first St. John's Church, for the money spent for opening up the altarpiece. So it was already around 1500 rather famous as a work of art. And one must really say, the Fight Chapel was of course a place for service and a religious place, and there was a daily mass that had been stipulated by the donors of the altarpiece, but it was at the same time a kind of museum, if I may say so. It was already a place where a famous artwork was admired without much thought at the religious content. And as I said, that continued until the 16th century, deep into the 16th century, and the work was first removed from its original location in 1566 when the iconoclasts came 2 days before they arrived in August 66. The work was taken apart and it was hidden in the tower, and it wasn't found. And afterwards it was immediately reinstalled in the chapel. But only about 10 years, 12 years later, it was again taken out. And that was the time of the Calvinist Republic in Ghent that started in 1578 and lasted until 84, when the city was Calvinist most of the time under the rule of Jan van Hembyse. And in around 78 or so, it was taken to the town hall, and with a certain intention. It was meant to be given to the Prince of Orange, William of Orange, as a gift, who was then supposed to give it to Queen Elizabeth. And the objective behind this all was, of course, to make friends with other potent Protestant rulers. And I must say, it is really, really astonishing to realize that such a quintessentially Catholic work as the Ghent altarpiece was meant to be a gift of honor, so to say, to Protestant rulers. And that makes clear, as a present to Elizabeth, it would have served merely, it would have been looked at merely as a kind of work of art, of course, and not as a religious work. I mean, that would have been absolutely untenable. So, nevertheless, in 1579, or at least in 1584, it was brought back to the church, and obviously it was most important to bring it back to the church, to claim the ownership of the altarpiece by descendants of the Veit and family, the donor family, and also to have it back in the church, as I said. And then it was for a time, for some months, placed here in the chapel of Viglius ab Aita, and it was placed there because the Veit Chapel was renovated at the time. So the important thing was not in the first place to bring it immediately in its original location, but to have it back in the church. So it was a matter of ownership, certainly, and I think this matter of ownership is even seen today. When I think back of the big Van Eyck exhibition in 2020, when all these panels who had been restored in the museum in Ghent had to be brought back during the exhibition to the cathedral in order to be shown there instead of showing them in the museum where they already were. So it is very clearly a statement of ownership, and that was already the case, obviously, in the late 16th century. So then it came back around 88, and so it came back, and then it remained there for a long time, admired, admired, but not respected in its integrity, in its aesthetical or aesthetical integrity. For in 1663 a porticus, and you can see here the columns, was erected around it to make it, to adapt it to the other modern altarpieces in the church, and it must have looked a little bit like this. So very different from it was at first. Nevertheless, the panels stayed in the chapel until 1794, when the French revolutionary troops came and took the three central panels to the Louvre. And this was a decisive moment for art history and for the Ghent altarpiece, because it was not so much loved by the French and the people at the Louvre, but it was suddenly discovered by Friedrich Schlegel, a young philosopher, who was absolutely enthusiastic about them, and he wrote that these works by Van Eyck are on a par with the works of Raphael, and that was, of course, blasphemic at the time, but it sparked and ignited the fire of romantic enthusiasm for early Netherlandish painting and the subsequent collecting of it. And so when in 1815 the central panels returned, the wing panels, which had been in a kind of a broom, how do you say, broom cupboard, right, were immediately sold to the dealer Christian Nieuwenhuis in 1816, and from there they went to the English merchant Edward Solly, who was living in Berlin, and he sold it to the Prussian king in 1821, while the neglected Adam and Eve panels first remained in St. Bavro but were not shown, and later on in the mid-19th century acquired by the Belgian state. So in the 19th century the altarpiece was divided in three portions, and this division was also most fruitful for the rest. So on the one hand side there started a kind of romantic recreation of an unviolated whole of the altarpiece, a kind of period room here in this painting by De Nota of 1829. It's a kind of period room, and all these objects, it's just as we have seen in the last lecture, they were in reality never there. And the Ghent altarpiece was not there. And this Ghent altarpiece of De Nota is based on an engraving published in 1824, I think, by Lieven de Bast, the Ghent scholar, and it's not even based on the originals, which were still in the chapel. So this is all fantasy. However, the fantasy of a perfect and a healed medieval time and a intact national heritage, so to say. And at the same time in Berlin, a kind of scientific and scholarly approach started, and one of the first things was that Gustav Friedrich Wagen in 1824 discovered the inscriptions on the original frames. This is the Berlin Museum around 1880, and this is the situation in Ghent from the second half of the 19th century on, when the original central panels were completed by copies from Michael Coxey from mid-16th century. So the panels in Berlin certainly stimulated very much of the early research on early Netherlandish painting, and by, for example, Giovanni Battista Krau and John Archer Krau and Giovanni Battista Cavacasselle, these famous pioneers in writing on early Netherlandish painting. They met for the first time in the Berlin Museum in front of the Ghent altarpiece in 1849 or 50. That was their first encounter, and that was the place where they decided to write a book on early Netherlandish painting. And of course, later on, Max Friedländer was stimulated by them. So it remains like this until 1920. 1 minute left. Okay, that's enough for the 20th century. In 1920, according to a stipulation of the Versailles Treaty, the Berlin panels were brought back to Belgium and were triumphantly reunited with the original central panels and with Adam and Eve, and they were re-erected in the Fight Chapel. And this is, of course, not the photo from 1920, but it is very strange. We do not have, I couldn't find any photo showing the altarpiece in its place after 1920, beside this, and this was made because, of course, the judges had just been stolen in 1934, and this is in the Fight Chapel, but I couldn't find anything that shows the whole thing. Well, and at least from the time when the Ghent altarpiece panel wings came back to Belgium in 1920, it has developed into a kind of national monument, and that was, of course, one of the reasons why the panels were fled from Ghent in 1940 when the German forces approached and were brought to Pau in southern France, and they are seized by the Germans in 1943, brought to Neuschwanstein in Bavaria, and finally to Alt-Aussee in Austria, a salt mine where they were discovered in May 1945 by American forces and brought back in triumph, and there's even a film on it, Le Retour de l'Agneau Mystique, and here you see the airplane, supposedly to bring them back to, not the Musée de Cinquantenaire, but to Brussels, and they were shown there in the Royal Museum, and before that even in the Royal Palace. So now it was a national monument, and it was brought in 1945 back to the Fight Chapel, and this is a modern photo showing only the photographic reproduction. As I said, I do not have a photo with the real work there, where it remained until 1950, when it was taken to Brussels again to be investigated and restored by Paul Koremans, and in 1951 it returned to this location where it stayed until 1986, and some of us were probably in the lucky position to have seen it there, because afterwards it was brought to the Villa Chapel under the northern tower into that kind of aquarium, and now recently it has been brought to the central chapel of the ambulatory, and this, of course, evokes an impression by most of the visitors that this is an in situ situation. And it is in a way here medieval looking, but not medieval, stained glass paintings and other statues, etc. It looks as if it is, besides the glass case, really in its original location. But one must say, before it was transported here last year, it had never been in this very chapel. So it is in situ if you mean the Church of St. Bavo, but absolutely not in situ if you mean the real location. Thank you very much.